Absolutely not. Margaret Whitfield's manicured fingers didn't even pause as they flipped through the quarterly budget reports spread across her mahogany desk. The corner office on the 47th floor of Whitfield Industries offered a breathtaking view of downtown Chicago, but right now all she could see were red numbers bleeding through her company's financial statements. Robert Santos stood in the doorway, his weathered hands gripping a crumpled piece of paper, his formal request for a raise that had taken him 3 weeks to write. At 62, Robert had been cleaning these offices for 18 years, arriving at 4 a.m. every morning and leaving long after the executive floors had emptied. His brown janitor's uniform was immaculate, pressed with the same care he applied to every corner he mopped, every window he polished. "Mrs. Whitfield, I was hoping we could discuss—" "There's nothing to discuss." Margaret's voice cut through the air like a blade. She finally looked up, her steel-gray eyes meeting his for exactly 2 seconds before returning to her papers. "The company is hemorrhaging money. We're laying off 12% of our workforce next month. You should be grateful you still have a job." Robert's shoulders sagged slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Ma'am, I understand times are tough, but I haven't had a raise in 4 years. My wife, she's got medical bills from her diabetes, and my grandson—" "I don't need your sob story, Robert." Margaret's pen clicked against the desk in an irritated rhythm. "Everyone has problems. The difference is some of us are responsible for solving them instead of creating more." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Robert had cleaned up after Margaret's tantrums before. The shattered coffee mugs, the scattered papers thrown in frustration when deals fell through, the wine stains on her carpet after particularly brutal board meetings. But this was different. This was personal cruelty wrapped in corporate efficiency. "Ma'am, I've never missed a day of work, never been late. I work weekends when you need me, holidays. And you're paid for every hour." Margaret stood up, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor as she moved to the window. "Look, Robert, you seem like a decent man, but business is business. We can't run a charity here. If you need more money, maybe you should have made better choices earlier in life." Robert folded the paper slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. "What kind of choices, ma'am?" Margaret turned around, surprised by the question. Most employees would have shuffled out by now, properly humiliated and dismissed. "Education, career planning, investing in yourself instead of—" She gestured vaguely at his uniform. "This, I see." Robert nodded slowly. "And you think this job, keeping your building clean, safe, presentable for all your important clients, this isn't investing in anything valuable?" There was something in his tone that made Margaret pause. It wasn't defiance exactly, but it wasn't submission either. It was disappointment, and somehow that stung more than anger would have. "It's honest work," she said, her voice slightly less sharp, "but it's not skilled work. Anyone can push a mop." "Anyone can push a mop," Robert repeated quietly. "Yes, ma'am. I suppose that's true." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Mrs. Whitfield, can I ask you something?" Margaret was already back at her desk, but she looked up with visible impatience. "What?" "Your son, Tyler. He's 14 now, right?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She straightened in her chair, every muscle tensing. "How do you know about Tyler?" "I've worked here 18 years, ma'am. I've seen him grow up in the photos on your desk, watched you pace this office during parent-teacher conferences, listened to you on phone calls with his school." Robert's voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath. "He's struggling, isn't he?" Margaret's face went white, then flushed red. "That's none of your business." "No, ma'am, it's not. But I want you to know, if you ever need help with reading, with tutoring— I taught high school English for 15 years before I came here. I know it might be hard to believe, but pushing a mop doesn't erase everything a person used to be." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at Robert as if he'd just spoken in a foreign language. "You were a teacher. Lincoln High School, South Side. Budget cuts eliminated my position in 2006. I was 50 years old, overqualified for most jobs, underqualified for the corporate world without an MBA. Robert's smile was sad but not bitter. Turns out janitorial work pays better than substitute teaching, and it comes with health insurance. My wife needed that insurance. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, a small fissure in the wall she'd built around her heart. "Why didn't you ever mention—" "Would it have mattered?" Robert asked simply. "Would knowing I had a master's degree in English literature from Northwestern make these floors any cleaner? Would it make my work more valuable to you?" The question hung between them like a bridge Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Her mouth opened, then closed. No words came. "I thought so," Robert said softly. "Have a good evening, Mrs. Whitfield. Don't work too late. Tyler needs his mother home sometimes." As the door closed behind him, Margaret sank into her chair as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. The budget reports in front of her, blurred as tears she hadn't shed in years, threatened to spill over. Tyler's latest report card was in her desk drawer, hidden beneath important contracts and merger documents. 3 Fs, 2 Ds, and a note from his English teacher. Tyler seems to have significant reading comprehension issues. Professional evaluation recommended. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Tyler's contact. The last text message he'd sent was from 3 days ago. "Mom, will you be home for dinner tonight?" She'd never responded. There had been a meeting, then another meeting, then drinks with investors that ran until midnight. Her reflection in the computer screen showed a woman she barely recognized. Hollow-eyed, sharp-featured, successful by every metric that mattered in her world. But Tyler's world was different. In Tyler's world, she was failing spectacularly. Margaret reached for her desk drawer and pulled out Tyler's report card again. The teacher's note seemed to glow on the page. "Professional evaluation recommended." She'd been putting it off for months, telling herself it was just a phase, that Tyler was smart but lazy, that he'd figure it out eventually. But deep down, she knew the truth she'd been avoiding. Her son couldn't read properly, and she had no idea how to help him. The irony tasted bitter in her mouth. She'd just dismissed a man who'd spent 15 years teaching students exactly like Tyler, and she'd done it with the kind of casual cruelty that she'd learned was necessary for business success. But this wasn't business. This was her child. She looked out at the Chicago skyline, at the thousands of windows glowing with warm light, families having dinner together, parents helping with homework, normal people living normal lives she'd traded away for corner offices and quarterly profits. Somewhere out there, Robert Santos was probably helping his own grandchild with reading, using skills she'd decided weren't valuable enough to pay for. The cleaning cart rattled softly in the hallway outside her office. Robert was still here, still working, still doing the job she'd told him anyone could do. Margaret found herself listening to the familiar sounds, the gentle swish of the mop, the quiet hum of the vacuum, the careful way he arranged everything back in its proper place. For 18 years, these sounds had been the soundtrack to her late nights at the office, as constant and reliable as her heartbeat. She thought about Tyler at home, probably struggling with homework he couldn't understand, maybe giving up and playing video games instead. His father had left when Tyler was 8, claiming Margaret cared more about her company than her family. At the time, she'd been furious at the accusation. Now, staring at her son's failing grades, she wondered if he'd been right. The cleaning sounds moved further down the hallway. Soon Robert would finish his shift and go home to his family, to a life she'd judged as less valuable than her own. But his grandson could probably read. His grandson probably had someone who came home for dinner, who helped with homework, who understood that some things mattered more than quarterly profits. Margaret picked up her phone again, thumb hovering over Tyler's contact. What would she say? "Sorry I've been absent for most of your life, but I just realized I don't know how to help you, and I may have just insulted the one person who could." The cleaning cart rattled again, closer now. Robert was making his way back down the hallway, finishing his rounds. In a few minutes he'd be gone, and with him any chance she had of swallowing her pride and asking for help. The pride that had built her company, that had earned her respect in boardrooms across the country, that had also apparently blinded her to her own son's struggles, and the wisdom of the man who'd been silently supporting her success for nearly 2 decades. Margaret Whitfield, CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation, sat alone in her corner office and realized she was about to lose the 2 most important things in her life: her son's future and her own humanity. And the man who might be able to help her save both was walking away, pushing a mop cart down the hallway, carrying 18 years of quiet dignity and a master's degree she'd never bothered to discover. The sounds of cleaning grew fainter. Soon there would be only silence, and Margaret would be left with her budget reports, her failing company, and a son who couldn't read, a son who needed exactly the kind of help she'd just arrogantly dismissed as worthless. Time was running out, and for the first time in her corporate career, Margaret Whitfield didn't know what to do. 3 days later, Margaret's world began to crumble in ways she never anticipated. It started with Tyler's phone call at 2:47 p.m., right in the middle of her presentation to the board of directors. Her phone buzzed insistently against the conference table as she explained the third quarter projections, but she ignored it. Tyler knew better than to call during work hours. The second call came 5 minutes later, then a third. "Excuse me for just one moment," Margaret said to the 12 executives staring at her expectantly. She stepped into the hallway and answered with barely contained irritation. "Tyler, I'm in the middle of..." "Mom, please come get me." His voice was shaking, thick with tears he was trying to hold back. They want to put me in the special class." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What special class?" "The reading class. For stupid kids." The words came out in a rush, each one like a knife through Margaret's chest. Everyone was staring at me. Jenny Morrison called me retarded, and Mr. Phillips didn't even stop her. "Please, Mom, just come get me. I can't do this anymore." The hallway seemed to tilt around Margaret. Through the glass doors, she could see the board members checking their watches, probably wondering if she was having some kind of breakdown. Her company was hanging by a thread, dependent on the merger she was supposed to be negotiating right now. But Tyler's broken voice cut through all of that, like nothing else could. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she heard herself say. "Really?" The hope in his voice was heartbreaking. "Really? Stay in the principal's office. Don't go back to class." Margaret walked back into the conference room with as much composure as she could muster. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid we'll need to reschedule. Family emergency." The looks of surprise and disapproval followed her out the door, but for once Margaret didn't care about their opinions. She had failed at something far more important than quarterly profits. The drive to Tyler's school was a blur of Chicago traffic and self-recrimination. When had she become the kind of mother who ignored her child's cries for help? When had she started measuring her success by stock prices instead of her son's happiness? She found Tyler huddled in a chair outside the principal's office, his backpack clutched against his chest like armor. At 14, he was tall for his age, but in that moment he looked like the scared little boy he'd been when his father left. "Mom," he whispered, and threw his arms around her. Margaret held him tight, breathing in the smell of his shampoo and the faint scent of school cafeteria pizza. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Principal Harrison emerged from his office, a kind man in his 50s who dealt with Margaret's absence at parent conferences with professional patience. "Mrs. Whitfield, thank you for coming. We need to discuss Tyler's academic situation." They sat in his office while Tyler waited outside. Principal Harrison spread Tyler's test results across his desk like evidence in a trial. "Tyler is a bright boy, but he's been struggling with reading comprehension for years. His teachers have been accommodating as much as possible, but he's fallen so far behind that we need to consider specialized intervention." Margaret stared at the papers, seeing her son's struggles laid out in graphs and percentages. "What kind of intervention?" "There are several options. We have a reading specialist who works with students who have learning disabilities. There's also a wonderful program at the community center. Volunteer tutors, many of them retired teachers. Very effective, very affordable." "Learning disabilities." The words felt foreign in Margaret's mouth. "Possibly dyslexia, though we'd need a formal evaluation to be certain. Mrs. Whitfield, this isn't Tyler's fault, and it's certainly not a reflection of his intelligence. Many successful people have overcome similar challenges, but he needs help, and he needs it now before his self-esteem is damaged beyond repair." Margaret thought about Tyler's phone call, the shame in his voice, the cruel words of his classmates. The damage might already be done. "What about private tutoring?" she asked. "Someone who could work with him one-on-one?" "That's certainly an option, though finding the right person can be challenging. Tyler needs someone who understands both the academic and emotional aspects of reading difficulties, someone patient, experienced with struggling readers, and skilled at rebuilding confidence." As Principal Harrison spoke, Margaret found herself thinking about Robert Santos. "I taught high school English for 15 years, he'd said. "If you ever need help with reading, with tutoring..." The irony was suffocating. 3 days ago, she'd dismissed him as unskilled, unworthy of a raise, just another service worker whose contributions didn't matter. Now she was learning that her son needed exactly the expertise she'd devalued. That evening, Margaret found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She cooked dinner. It was just spaghetti and jarred sauce, but Tyler's face lit up as if she'd prepared a feast. "This is really good, Mom," he said, twirling pasta around his fork with the concentration of someone for whom even simple tasks required extra effort. "Tyler," Margaret said carefully, "how long have you been having trouble reading?" His fork stopped moving. "I don't know. A long time." "Why didn't you tell me?" Tyler's eyes filled with tears again. "I tried. Remember in 5th grade when you were always working late? I told you my homework was too hard, and you said I just needed to try harder. So I tried harder, but it didn't help." The words still looked all mixed up. Margaret's chest tightened. She remembered that conversation, remembered brushing off his concerns because she'd been distracted by a contract negotiation. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I should have listened. Are you going to send me to the stupid kids class?" "There are no stupid kids, Tyler. There are just different ways of learning, and we're going to find the right way for you. That night, after Tyler went to bed, Margaret sat in her home office staring at her laptop screen. She'd pulled up the company directory and found Robert Santos's employee file. 18 years of perfect attendance, 18 years of performance reviews that described him as reliable, thorough, and professional. Not one mention of his teaching background. She thought about her son, brilliant and funny and kind, reduced to tears by his inability to decode words that came so easily to others. She thought about Robert, quietly dignified despite her casual cruelty, offering help even after she'd insulted everything he'd worked for. Margaret Whitfield had built her career on making difficult decisions, but the decision she needed to make now felt impossible. How do you ask for help from someone you've just humiliated? How do you admit that the person you dismissed as worthless might be the only one who can save your child? Outside her window, Chicago glittered with the lights of 1,000 other families, other parents who probably tucked their children in and helped with homework, and knew how to ask for help when they needed it. For the first time in her life, Margaret Whitfield envied them. If this story is touching you in some way, comment where you're watching from. Every place has its own struggles. And sometimes it's incredible to see how we all connect through such human stories. Margaret arrived at the office at 5:30 a.m. the next morning, 2 hours before her usual time. She needed to catch Robert before the executive floors filled with employees who might witness what she was about to do. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt endless, each floor a reminder of how far she was about to fall from her pedestal of pride. She found Robert in the break room, methodically organizing his cleaning supplies with the same precision she applied to her business deals. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "Mrs. Whitfield, you're here early." Margaret stood in the doorway, her prepared speech evaporating like morning mist. She'd rehearsed this conversation during 3 sleepless hours, but facing Robert's quiet dignity made every word sound hollow and self-serving. "Robert, She cleared her throat and tried again. "I need to talk to you." "Of course, ma'am." He set down his spray bottle and gave her his full attention, the same respectful focus he'd maintained for 18 years despite her indifference. "My son Tyler," Margaret began, her voice catching slightly. "He's struggling in school. With reading." Robert nodded, his expression gentle but unsurprised. "I wondered about that. The way you've been working later hours, the phone calls with his school, it's been weighing on you." Margaret stared at him. "You knew." "I've been cleaning these offices for 18 years, Mrs. Whitfield. I've seen you through good times and bad. A parent's worry has its own sound." He paused, then added quietly, "Is Tyler okay?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern for a boy Robert had never met, nearly undid Margaret completely. When was the last time someone had asked about Tyler with such sincere care? "No," she whispered. "He's not okay. His classmates are calling him stupid. His teachers want to put him in special classes. He's ashamed, Robert. He's ashamed of himself, and it's breaking my heart." Robert pulled out a chair at the small break room table. "Would you like to sit down?" Margaret looked at the plastic chair, then at her designer suit, then back at Robert's kind eyes. She sat down. "Tyler's been struggling for years," she continued, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. "I missed the signs. I was too busy with meetings and mergers, and I failed him. I failed my own son." "No, Mom," Robert said firmly. "You're here now, that's what matters." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Am I? Do you know what I'm about to ask you, Robert?" "I think I do. 3 days ago, I told you that your work wasn't skilled, wasn't valuable. I denied you a raise and basically called you a failure." Margaret's voice grew thick with shame. "And now I'm here to beg you to help my son with the very skills I dismissed as worthless." Robert was quiet for a long moment, cleaning his glasses with a small cloth from his pocket. "Mrs. Whitfield, can I tell you something about my teaching days?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "I had a student once, Maria Gonzalez, smart as a whip, but she couldn't read past a 3rd grade level in 8th grade. Her mother worked 3 jobs and spoke limited English. Maria was convinced she was stupid, just like Tyler." Robert's eyes grew distant with memory. It took 2 years of patient work, but Maria not only learned to read, she graduated valedictorian and got a full scholarship to Northwestern. She's a pediatric nurse now. "What's your point?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew. "My point is that intelligence comes in many forms, and so does failure. Maria's mother didn't fail her. Poverty and circumstance did. You haven't failed, Tyler. Sometimes we just miss what we're not looking for." Robert leaned forward slightly. The real failure would be doing nothing now that you know. Margaret felt tears threatening again. Will you help him? Of course I will. The answer came so quickly, so simply, that Margaret was stunned. Just like that. After how I treated you. Robert smiled, and for the first time, Margaret saw not just the janitor she'd dismissed, but the teacher he'd always been. Mrs. Whitfield, I didn't offer to help Tyler to make you feel better about yourself. I offered because a 14-year-old boy is struggling, and I have the skills to help him. That's reason enough. I can pay you, Margaret said quickly. Whatever you charge for tutoring. No, ma'am. Robert's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't about money. Then what is it about? Robert stood up and began gathering his cleaning supplies again, preparing to continue his rounds. It's about remembering that every person has value, Mrs. Whitfield. Every job has dignity. Every child deserves a chance to succeed. He paused at the door. Even the sons of executives who forget that janitors used to be teachers. The words weren't harsh, but they hit Margaret like a physical blow. She sat alone in the break room as Robert's footsteps faded down the hallway, the sound of his cleaning cart growing distant. Through the small window, she could see the Chicago skyline awakening, office lights flickering on, early commuters heading to work, the city preparing for another day of business as usual. But nothing felt usual anymore. Margaret Whitfield, who had built her reputation on never showing weakness, had just been schooled in humanity by the man she'd tried to crush with her corporate indifference. And somehow, instead of feeling defeated, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. Mom, are you coming home for dinner tonight? For the first time in months, Margaret typed back immediately, Yes, sweetheart, and I have good news to share. As she walked back to her office, Margaret caught her reflection in the elevator doors. She looked the same power suit, same confident posture, but something fundamental had shifted. She was still the CEO of Whitfield Industries, but more importantly, she was Tyler's mother. And thanks to a millionaire janitor with more grace than she'd ever possessed, her son was going to learn to read. The elevator reached the 47th floor, and Margaret stepped out into her domain of marble and mahogany. But now she understood something she'd forgotten in her climb to the top. True wealth isn't measured in quarterly profits or corner offices. It's measured in the kindness we show to others, especially when they can do nothing for us in return. And in that moment, Robert Santos was the richest man she'd ever met. 6 weeks later, Margaret stood outside the community center where Robert had been tutoring Tyler every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Through the window, she could see her son bent over a book, his face lit with concentration rather than frustration for the first time in years. Robert sat beside him, patient and encouraging, pointing to words and nodding as Tyler sounded them out. Mom! Tyler's voice rang out as she entered the small classroom. Listen to this. He began reading aloud from a young adult novel, his voice steady and confident. The words that had once twisted and blurred on the page now flowed naturally, unlocking stories and ideas that had been trapped behind his learning difficulties. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at Robert, who was packing up his teaching materials with the same methodical care he applied to his janitorial duties. How can I ever thank you? Robert smiled. You just did. Seeing Tyler succeed is thanks enough. As they walked to the parking lot, Tyler chattered excitedly about the book he was reading, the words tumbling out in a rush of newfound joy. Margaret watched her son's animated face and felt a profound gratitude that went beyond anything she'd ever experienced in the boardroom. Mr. Santos, Tyler said suddenly, why do you clean offices when you're such a good teacher? Robert paused, his hand on his car door. Well, Tyler, sometimes life takes us down paths we didn't expect. The important thing is to find meaning wherever we are. Margaret found herself studying Robert more closely. His car was modest but well-maintained, his clothes simple but quality. There was something about his quiet confidence that went beyond the dignity of honest work, something she'd been too blind to see before. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the office to find her assistant, Janet, waiting with an expression of barely contained excitement. Mrs. Whitfield, you need to see this, Janet said, thrusting a newspaper toward her. The Chicago Tribune's business section featured a headline that made Margaret's world tilt. Local philanthropist Robert Santos donates $2 million to city literacy programs. Margaret stared at the article, reading it twice before the words sank in. Robert Santos, age 62, had made his fortune through careful investments in tech stocks during the early days of Microsoft and Apple. His janitorial salary had been supplemented by dividends that had grown into a substantial portfolio. The article detailed his anonymous donations to schools, literacy programs, and scholarships for underprivileged students. The irony, the article concluded, is that Mr. Santos continues to work as a janitor, claiming that honest work keeps him grounded and connected to the community he serves. Margaret sank into her chair, the newspaper trembling in her hands. Robert Santos, the man she'd dismissed as unskilled, the man she'd denied a raise, the man she'd judged for his choices, was worth more than most of her board members, and he'd been quietly changing lives while she'd been focused on quarterly profits. Her phone rang. It was Robert. "Mrs. Whitfield, I hope you'll forgive the deception." His voice was calm but tinged with embarrassment. "I never intended for this to become public. A reporter found out about the donations and—" "Robert," Margaret interrupted, "why didn't you tell me?" There was a long pause. "Would it have changed how you treated me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret thought about her behavior, the casual dismissals, the assumption that wealth equaled worth, the way she'd judged him based on his uniform rather than his character. "It should have," she whispered. "But honestly, probably not. Not until Tyler." "That's why I didn't tell you," Robert said gently. "I wanted to help Tyler because he needed help, not because his mother discovered I had money. Real generosity isn't about getting credit, Mrs. Whitfield. It's about doing what's right when no one's watching." That afternoon, Margaret called an emergency board meeting. The executives filed into the conference room, expecting to discuss the merger that had been on hold since Tyler's crisis 6 weeks earlier. "Gentlemen," Margaret began, "I want to talk about value, real value." She told them about Robert Santos, not just about his wealth, but about his character, about his 18 years of faithful service, his quiet dignity, his expertise that she'd overlooked, and his generosity that put them all to shame. "We're restructuring our compensation packages," Margaret announced, "starting with our support staff, and we're implementing profit sharing for all employees, not just executives." Board member Harrison Blackwell frowned. "Margaret, the company is still recovering from—" "The company is recovering because of people like Robert Santos," Margaret interrupted. "People who show up every day, who take pride in their work, who contribute in ways we've been too arrogant to recognize. If we can't afford to treat our employees with dignity, then we don't deserve to be in business." The meeting erupted in arguments about fiduciary responsibility and shareholder interests, but Margaret held firm. She'd learned something more valuable than any business principle. True success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. 3 months later, Whitfield Industries was featured in Forbes for its innovative employee satisfaction programs. The article mentioned that the company's transformation began when the CEO discovered that one of their janitors was secretly a millionaire philanthropist. But Margaret knew the real story was simpler than that. It wasn't about discovering Robert's wealth. It was about discovering her own humanity. Tyler was now reading at grade level, his confidence restored by patient tutoring and unconditional support. Margaret was home for dinner every night, helping with homework, and actually listening to her son's stories. And Robert Santos continued to arrive at 4 a.m. every morning, not because he needed the money, but because he understood something Margaret was finally learning. Dignity comes from service, not status. And now that you've reached the end, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Your presence matters, and your story does too. The janitor who had been denied a raise had taught a CEO the most valuable lesson of her life. The worth of a person isn't found in their bank account or their job title. It's found in their willingness to lift others up, especially when they have nothing to gain from it. And sometimes the richest person in the room is the one pushing the mop.